Hello, my name is Ray Hughes, and I'm an interviewer for the Veterans History Project conducted by the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. and locally administered here at the Cincinnati-Hamilton County Public Library in Cincinnati, Ohio, and administered personally by Brian Powers, who happens to be our cameraman today. Today's date is the 27th of February. It's a Wednesday, 2019. And today we have the honor and privilege of interviewing U.S. Navy veteran Gerald Patrick Motl, M-O-T-L. And Captain Motl, it's a pleasure to meet you.
Thank you. Pleasure meeting you. Heard a lot about you.
Thank you for being here. And would it be all right to address you as Jerry today during the interview?
Sure, absolutely.
Well, if you would, Jerry, tell us when and where you were born.
I was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, July of 1946. My dad was a bombardier in the Army Air Corps. Came back from the war, got married, and I was the first child.
I see. And do you have any brothers and sisters?
I have a brother, Jimmy. He unfortunately was killed in an accident when I was at the Naval Academy, and a sister, Peggy.
Now, your father's name?
Edward H. Motl.
Edward H. And your mother's name?
Lily Grace Motl.
And what was your mother's maiden name?
Berka, B-E-R-K-A.
B-E-R-K-A?
Yes.
Yeah. And what did your father do for a living?
He was a jeweler. His dad started a jewelry store in Milwaukee South Side on Mitchell Street in like 1910 or 15. And my dad took it over when he died.
I see.
And ran it with my uncle.
And your grandfather's name was?
He was Edward H. Motl Sr.
Uh-huh. And your grandmother's name?
My grandmother's name on my dad's side?
On the Motl side, yes.
Her name was Mary.
Mary.
And I forget her maiden name. Mary.
Well, that's all right.
I forgot.
What schools did you go to, Jerry?
Well,
grade school and?
Went to Holy Cross Grade School, a Catholic grade school close to Wauwatosa on Blue Mountain Road. Good Catholic school run by the School Sisters of Notre Dame. And after graduating there, I went to Marquette High School, a Jesuit high school on 35th of Wisconsin Avenue. I know you're familiar with that. And then finally the Naval Academy.
I see. And what churches did you folks go to?
Well, Holy Cross Church was the grade school church. As a matter of fact, we went there our entire life until I left Milwaukee.
You said your dad was a B-17 pilot? Or
no, he was a bombardier.
A bombardier. And did your father come out of the war unscathed, so to speak?
Yeah, he started out enlisted. He was an instructor on the Norden bomb site, I believe. And then he was commissioned, and then he trained as a bombardier. And apparently he was just getting ready to go to the Far East when they dropped the atomic bomb, which probably is one of the reasons I'm here.
Yes, yeah.
And then, of course, after the war, he went back to civilian life as a jeweler.
While you were in high school and things, did you play any sports or get involved in any other activities at school?
Yes, I played baseball and football and did a lot of other things too. I
see. Were you a letterman, so to speak?
Yes, both sports, and we were conference champions at both sports.
I see. And were these all male schools that you went to, or because
No, the grade school was co-ed with Marquette High School at the time. Jesuit was all male.
I see. And when did you join the United States Navy?
Well, I graduated from Marquette High in '64, and in June 30th of '64, went to Annapolis. So basically, I had 3 weeks off before heading off to the Naval Academy.
Now, how does one get into Annapolis?
Well, you have to get an appointment, congressional or a Senate appointment, and you have to go through an application process. That's fairly rigorous, and if you're lucky enough, you get an appointment, which means you're on the list. There are principal appointments and alternate appointments, and the Congress sorts it out, and then they pick out who they want to go.
And Congress picks that out?
Well,
now, you're recommended by somebody, though, aren't you?
The congressman. The congressman typically has, I think, 5 appointment slots. And of course, that's for a 4-year period, so there's some algorithm they use, but the congressmen and the senators and their other sources of ways to be appointed to the Naval Academy.
I see. And who was a congressman at
Clement Zablocki.
Zablocki?
Zablocki, good South Side Milwaukee Polish guy.
Polish, SKI.
Mhm.
Yeah. So when did you get accepted into the Naval Academy?
Well, I think the actual acceptance was like in January of '64. You had to go through a long process before then, but the actual appointments were like in January of '64 before we entered in June of '64.
I see. And what's the process involved?
Well, you have to take the SATs, you have to go through interviews, you have to submit all sorts of documentation and letters of recommendation, and it all goes into most congressmen, including Congressman Zablocki, they have a selection panel, and they look at all of the information, they do interviews, and it's a fairly rigorous process.
Mm-hmm. So you would enter then in June of '64, you say?
June 30th, '64 was the day I entered, yes.
So is it run like a semester system there at the Naval Academy? Or?
Yeah, 4 years, there are 2 semesters in each year, but there are special programs obviously during the summer where you do special training.
Okay. And what kind of special training did you have that first summer?
Well, the first summer is called plebe summer. Plebe is, as you know, the lowest of the low. And that's where you go through the military indoctrination, and for 2 months, July and August, before the brigade returns for the fall semester, you get run by upperclassmen, and it's fairly brutal, and many people drop out then. They try to separate the men from the boys, and very intense physically, mentally, very challenging. And like I say, my plebe summer roommate didn't even last the summer. And so it was difficult to try to separate the men from the boys, so to speak.
Yeah. And so the actual semester would start in September?
Yes.
Before I get to that first semester, what inclined you to join the Navy to begin with? Your dad was in the Air Force. And
well, actually my uncle, apparently he knew Congressman Zablocki. He suggested that I try out for a service academy. And I ordered 3 catalogs, Air Force, West Point, and Naval Academy, and looked at the pictures. And if you look at West Point in the wintertime, it doesn't look as good as springtime in Annapolis. And I picked Annapolis, and I'm glad I did.
Yeah. Okay. What a real scientific
well,
method.
I was 17.
Yeah.
That's the way it goes. You're
Yeah.
17.
Yes. So explain the beginning of your education there in September.
Well, in September you were still in plebe year, but basically it was a classic semester. You had a fall and a spring semester. You had 5 or 6 courses. They were generic courses up until the point where you chose a major, which would take place a year later. But typical college in the sense of the academics, totally untypical in every other sense, because you were going through plebe year, and plebe year, was not fun. I mean, you'd be up at 6, you'd be running around laps, you'd be running around Farragut Field at 4:30 in the morning, you'd be doing push-ups, you'd be carrying rifles over your head. You were memorizing your rates. You had Reef Points, a little book. You had to memorize stuff. You had to do a newspaper report every morning. Very difficult. I mean, a lot of people dropped out during plebe summer, and I might add that during that plebe summer, you had to do newspaper reports every morning, which is no big deal. But one of the newspaper reports was the Tonkin Gulf incident occurred. This was in the summer of '64. So we just entered the Naval Academy, and this was really the start of the Vietnam War. Right. And that was to continue on for my entire Naval Academy and subsequent career. You were just trying to survive plebe summer is what it amounted to. You had to get through it.
And you lived in the quarters that you lived in. Did you have a room to yourself, or?
Well, it was Bancroft Hall is the dorm where all midshipmen live, and there are rooms that either 2 or 3 to a room, so we always had a roommate. So yes, we were in a room with a roommate.
Did you have the same roommates most of the time you were at the academy?
In general, some people did, some people switched. Every year when you would come back after your summer training, you of course get a new room assignment. And in many cases, people would stick together. In some cases, they would switch for whatever reason. And sometimes it was just the logistics of the 2-3 business, and other times people had a preference for a roommate or against a roommate.
Did you have a particular roommate that you remember this even now in the later years?
Oh, sure. Paul Willoughby was my favorite roommate.
And did Paul Willoughby go on to become famous or anything?
Not famous, but famous enough. He was a pilot, not a pilot. I think he flew helicopters, or P-3s. I think P-3s, patrol aircraft. And he's good man from Maine.
I see. So your first year is over, and well, actually, what private life were you able to have, so to speak, that first year?
None.
Somebody was watching over you the whole time?
Oh, yeah, really none. I mean, not at the Naval Academy.
And
if you would go home for Christmas leave, you would be alone. But when you were at the Naval Academy, morning, noon, and night, I mean, in the middle of the night, people could come in your room and have you do push-ups, you know.
Oh, is that right?
Oh, yeah, it was brutal.
So when did you first get to come home then on your first year there?
Christmas.
Christmas?
Christmas of '64.
And then you went back for the second semester?
Mm-hmm. Actually, you went back right after Christmas. You still had 2 or 3 weeks before the first semester ended at the end of January. Then the second semester would start.
Explain your second year then. You're no longer a plebe, so to speak, then, I guess?
Well, the second year is you're a sophomore, and they call it youngster year. And of course, between plebe year and youngster year, you go on what they call youngster cruise. So in other words, in June of '65, you basically went through the next summer on a cruise. And I was on a ship called the USS Columbus, which was a cruiser out of San Diego. And you would basically, we went up the coast, went to Hawaii, had lots of good times, but you went on the cruise as an enlisted man. In other words, you would stand watch in various roles to learn what it was like to be an enlisted man and learn how the ship worked, et cetera, et cetera. And actually, I had an interesting experience I want to tell you about. We were in San Diego, and they asked, who would like to take a submarine to San Francisco? And I was 17 at the time. I said, I'll do that. So at about 4 in the morning, woke up from our bunks, and we got in a little van, and we went to Ballast Point, the submarine base in San Diego. And they point to a submarine, and there it is, USS Redfish, AGSS 395, World War II submarine that actually sunk a Japanese aircraft carrier. So we go on board, this is like 3 or 4 in the morning, and we got to sleep for a few hours. We go to the forward torpedo room, and the guy says, you're sleeping up there, right over a torpedo. And I said, oh, this is cool. You know, I'm 17, I thought this was cool. So basically, I went to bed, got up in the morning. We went into the wardroom where the officers were. You know, we were midshipmen, so theoretically we're like officers. So we sat down for breakfast, and a steward comes up to me and says, what would you like for breakfast? And he says, how would you like your eggs? And I go, are you talking to me? We just finished plebe year. You know? He says, how would it's easy over. And so that was kind of a shock. And so we traveled to San Francisco. Of course, we were submerged, and in San Francisco we came under the Golden Gate Bridge on a surface, and I was topside. I was on this. The submarine was surfaced. We were topside, and I'm on topside. We're going under the Golden Gate Bridge, and I look up, could not see the Golden Gate Bridge because it was so foggy. So that was my first submarine experience, and it was really a lot of fun.
And after you got to San Francisco, did you continue on a cruiser?
Yeah, we basically went up to Seattle, and then also went to Hawaii. That was on a cruiser, yes, because the Columbus followed us into San Francisco, and we got back on the cruiser.
Oh, okay. So while you were on the submarine, the Columbus is following you up.
Yeah,
there.
Exactly. No part of a.
Yeah. So how long were you in Hawaii?
I forget, probably about a week.
Any experiences going to Hawaii on board the Columbus?
None that I can remember.
This is actually your first time at sea, isn't it?
First time at sea, yes. We had a good time in Hawaii. I mean, you know, we had a good time. We go to Waikiki Beach, and we would drink beer, you know, and of course, you go to the officers club, and we were considered officers. We could buy beers for 25 cents, you know, and so most of us had our first drinking experience during that cruise.
Did you, how did being at sea affect you? I'm talking about a lot of times.
I did not. I never had a problem. You know, cruisers are of course bigger than destroyers, and so I never had a problem with seasicknesses on a surface ship.
And anything else about Hawaii you want to share with us?
Well, I went to a luau. You know, just toured the place like crazy. You know, we just had a great time.
What did you actually learn while you were on the cruiser, Columbus?
Well, you learned watch standing. You know, primarily again, this was as enlisted. So basically, let's say in the boiler room or in the engine room, you know, people stand watching. We would basically be assigned to a position. Then we would learn. We'd have a prac fact book. We'd have to have certain evolutions signed off, questions answered. You know, it's basically a qualification to learn, you know, how the ship works.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it makes sense. You know, eventually you're going to be the officer of the deck and the bridge.
Right.
You have to understand how things work, and this is how we learned how things worked.
And this is in your first year already.
Exactly.
Yeah. So you leave Hawaii and come back. Where do you come back to?
Well, we went back into San Diego, and then basically this was like 7 or 8 weeks, and then we had a month leave. August was typically a month for leave to go back home for a month before going back to Annapolis for your second year.
Now, when you went home for a month then?
Yes.
Now, do you have a girlfriend or anything of this nature where you're?
Not a special one, no. I mean, I had girlfriends, and but none that was like my one and only.
Okay, I'm just curious. So you're back at Annapolis. Where is Annapolis?
Okay,
I forgot to ask you that
well,
to
of course,
begin with.
it's in Maryland. It's about 50 miles east of Washington, right on the Severn River, which runs into the Chesapeake Bay.
And it's a village itself, a city, Annapolis.
Well, it's the capital of Maryland, you know, formed like in 1690. And so it's a capital. Naval Academy was formed there 1845. So it's, well, actually the Naval Academy, yeah, it was 1845. The Naval Academy went to Newport for a few years during the Civil War. But basically 1845 is when the Naval Academy was founded in Annapolis.
I see, okay. Anything else about the history of when it was formed and who formed it? And
well,
the
you
first
know,
command?
it was very important in the founding of our country. You know, I mean, it's close to Washington. Every famous American you ever heard of has been in Annapolis.
1845 is when it was formed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And that's well. And did they move during the Civil War?
And during the Civil War, there was concern, obviously, that the Confederates would attack Washington and Annapolis, which was so close.
Right.
So they temporarily moved the Naval Academy to Newport, Rhode Island, and it remained there for the war, and then moved back to Annapolis.
Okay. So after your 30-day leave, I guess you had, you went back for your second year.
Right, and you weren't a plebe then, and now you were not harassed all the time. Now you were more or less left alone, although you were still an underclassman, relatively speaking.
And what's the second year like at?
Well, second year was more enjoyable just because you weren't being harassed all the time. You know, we ate well. We got a great education. You participated in a sport every semester. You know, we called tea dances. They would have dances in Dahlgren Hall where they would invite girls from the local women's colleges, and you know, they would meet the midshipmen and have a dance. We'd go to football games. You know, every year we'd go to the Army-Navy game in Philadelphia. Every second year, Army or Navy Notre Dame in Philadelphia or Baltimore. So, you know, a lot of football, basketball, you know, sports oriented, you know, very busy time. I mean, very busy.
And the studies are what type of studies now in your second year?
Well, first of all, everybody has a basic core in engineering, but you do have majors. Matter of fact, my class was the first year we selected a major, and I selected the theoretical math. But you could major in a number of different fields, mostly engineering again, because you know, you don't want to take poetry at the Naval Academy. They want you to take nuclear operations. You know.
Yeah. What else about your second year you want to share with us?
Well, it was really just a great
You have
relief.
the same roommates that you had?
I think I may have changed roommates, but you know, it's much calmer. You know, no plebe hose, no running around. I mean, you actually were It was now like a school with a military regiment. You had parades once a week. You go out to Warden Field, and everybody would march in a parade for everybody to look at. And it was.
Do you have any type of infantry training, so to speak, with rifles and
well, you do a lot of running and climbing, and we had rifles that we used to march. We would have to go to the rifle range and learn how to shoot. You could actually qualify in pistols and in rifles. And yes, that was part of the training.
And what was the climbing you were referring to? Climbing?
Well, you know, like obstacle courses, you had walls and ropes,
yeah.
and like boot camp.
Uh-huh. Now that's continuous training like that?
It was primarily just during the summer, as I recall.
Just during the summer. Well, let's move on to your third year then, unless.
Okay, well, third year, let me say that after the second year, you had that summer before your third year, and that was a different kind of training. Whereas we learned how to be an enlisted man on a surface ship the first summer, now we went to learn how to be a Marine, submarines, and other things. They had like shorter courses in different places. At that point, believe it or not, I was on a football team, and I actually missed the Marine training because football practice started early. But that's where we went up to New London. That's where I got my first taste of submarines.
At New London?
In New London, where the submarine school is.
Yeah, explain that to us then, if you would.
Well, submarine school was formed, I think, in like 1918, something like that, and that's where all submariners learn how to be a submariner. And it's in New London, Connecticut. And at the time I actually went, the course was shortened, but you basically got a taste of what it was like to be a submariner. You went through a escape tank, a big tank of water, and let's say you were in a submarine on the surface of the ocean, trapped, and you had to escape. You know, they had these hoods you would put over your head, and we have to blow and go up a huge tower of water to basically get out of the submarine that had been sunk on the bottom. And there were other training, you know, associated with being a submariner. And that's where they give a taste. They try to give you a taste of what it was like to be a Marine, a submariner, an aviator, et cetera, et cetera. And also during that summer, we would go and went to Pensacola to learn how to fly.
Oh, really?
Not learn how to fly, but to basically get experience flying. And actually, I have a story there. One of the first things they have you do is they had these planes called T-28s. They were trainers. Mm-hmm. And we actually would land on an aircraft carrier. I think it was, I don't know, it was a Lexington, or I forget the name of the submarine. But basically, we were going to take a flight with a pilot. The pilot was in the front seat, we were in the back seat. And say, okay, we're going to fly off and land on the aircraft carrier. And of course, they had barf bags for us in case you could get sick. So we take off, and we're getting ready to land on this aircraft carrier in the Gulf. And the guy ahead of us, you would get arrested and stop, and then you take off again. You would kind of come like this. And the guy ahead of us was too slow, and we got waved off twice. You're coming in for a landing, and all of a sudden you get waved off. He goes, coming again, gets waved off again. So now the pilot's getting impatient. So he's going like this. I'm saying to myself, I'm starting to feel a little sick here. So I look for my barf bag, and it's on the deck between my feet. Now I'm all strapped in.
Right.
And I said to myself, I don't think I want to take the seatbelt off before I'm ready to land on an aircraft carrier. As I'm thinking about this, I throw up. Now he by the way, had the hood, the cockpit hood, open a little bit, so it's really windy. So I throw up, and there's puke all over the cockpit. And it was horrible.
Yeah.
So we ended up landing finally, and we got back to base after taking off again. And when we got off the airplane, the pilot says, "Do you want to be an aviator?" And I said, "Hell no." And then I had to take a toothbrush, and I had to clean the cockpit. In addition, I had a helmet mask with a little talking piece that was borrowed from another pilot. I had to go clean out the talking with a puke. So that's why I became a submariner. There you go.
Good gosh. Yeah, that must have been some experience. I've only read about landing on aircraft carriers, speaking with John Steele, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I don't. That takes a lot of guys to other.
Yeah, well, aviators, they think the submariners are crazy.
The T-28, what was that equal to? I know they had T-6s for the regular Air Corps at that time.
Yeah, I don't know. They were training aircraft. They were big airplane. You know, they had propellers, and they had a front and a rear cockpit seat,
Mhm.
and they were used for training. T-28, T stands for training.
Yeah. So go on with after that experience,
Well, after let's see here, we're after.
and that was down in Florida, right?
That was down in Florida.
Yeah.
So now that was second class year. So now you go basically, getting confused, after your second class year.
And you know, the other thing, I wanted to just touch before I forgot it, is when you're learning how to escape out of the submarine, and you're propelled up. That's at the time after, it's very important because that's right after the Thresher.
Right.
I'm sure you guys all had that on your mind. Yeah.
Because the funny thing is, we did this from like 100 feet or 150 feet. You put a stanky hood on, you had to blow. You know, when you're in a mile of water, you know, that doesn't work.
Yeah.
And but they still do that, I think.
Yeah. Well, that's good. I didn't mean to sidetrack you there, but I remembered that was the time of the Thresher, which was a terrible. That was April of '63. Yeah. When we lost all those men.
And then we had the Scorpions subsequently.
Yes. Yes. So your third year now.
Well, the third year, second class year, after the second class year was basically you were now second classman, first classman are above you, and now you're running the plebes. Remember, you were a plebe, all these people were treating you bad. Now you're a second classman, you're treating the plebes bad. But so it was more or less a regular year, and then after junior year, second class year, you have what you call a first class cruise. And first class cruise is where you take another cruise, much like you did when you were a youngster, but now you go as a junior officer. And I was assigned to the USS Galveston CG-3 in the Mediterranean. And that was really a great time. We flew to Rota, Spain, and then we flew to Ceuta Bay, Crete, got on a ship, and cruised all over the place. And again, now we're standing watches with officers on the bridge, as officer of the deck. And so now you're learning how to be an officer. And one of the interesting things there was, this was when the 6-day war started between Israel and Egypt. And this is when the Liberty was attacked.
Yes.
Torpedoed, napalmed, et cetera, et cetera. The Liberty pulled into Valletta, Malta. We pulled into Valletta, Malta and went on board the Liberty. Now, we're 19 or 20 years old. We go on board, and there's literally, they've been torpedoed, napalmed. We're talking to these young sailors who are just our age. They're talking about these 40 people or whatever was got killed, and it was horrible, So I mean, this was like a huge eye opener. In case you thought the Navy was Naval Academy was just Army Navy games and rah-rah, that was kind of an eye opener that this was serious business. And
yes.
So that was first class cruise, and then you went back for basically a month of leave before returning to Annapolis for your senior or your first class year.
What was the scuttlebutt, or if that's the right word, about that attack by the Israelis on our ship?
Well, I don't know if it's official or unofficial. The Israelis basically say that it was an accident.
Right.
Of course, this was right off the coast of Egypt during the war, and of course, emotions were high. I mean, I can't give an official ruling. A lot of people think that they were a little too hasty in attacking the ship because we had the flag flying, as I understand, and it was an American ship and it was marked as such. But that was an interesting time.
It certainly was. It had to be an eye opener for you.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, it wasn't just Army Navy game rah rah.
Right. It wasn't a football game anymore.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Well, and so if you will, we'll go, I guess, into your senior year at the academy.
Well, senior year, you were now at the top of the pecking order. Again, the second classmen, the juniors, did most of the harassing of the plebes. So now you were basically, your senior year, you were now thinking about your career assignment. You're going to go submarines, aviation, Marine Corps, whatever it may be. It was a nice year, but there was so much going on in the world. For example, in the spring of '68, the Tet Offensive was going on in Vietnam. And of course, at the Naval Academy, a lot of Naval Academy grads were being killed, and especially Marines and aviators. And in Memorial Hall, when somebody was killed, they'd have a little picture and memento. So you would go to Memorial Hall, and you would see dozens of pictures of your fellow midshipmen who the year or two or three before were with you at the Naval Academy, and now they're in heaven, you know. So that was an eye-opener. And then in the spring of '68, not only the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, but Martin Luther King was assassinated. And of course, the whole country went wild. Matter of fact, I think it was spring break, and I was actually in Milwaukee and flew back. And you know, we were ready to defend the Naval Academy, believe it or not, with our marching rifles with bayonets. I mean, it was just a crazy time. And then the day I graduated, June 5th, '68, the night before, Robert Kennedy was assassinated. Right. So, you know, when I graduated, the whole world was in turmoil. And guess where my first assignment was? Nuclear Power School in San Francisco. The hippies, the heydays, Gracie Slick, Jefferson Airplane.
Yes. Yeah.
What a world of difference.
Boy, did you have any problems with the civilians? Because you're in uniform when you...
I never did.
Jumping the gun a little bit there, but...
I never did, and of course, you know, I didn't normally travel in uniform. You know, when, you know, for example, my first assignments were Nuclear Power School in California. You basically lived near the Nuclear Power School in Vallejo. You put on your uniform to go to work and back. You know, it wasn't like you were cruising around San Francisco in your uniform. Then I went to Idaho, to the Nuclear Power Training Unit, where you learn how to operate a nuclear reactor. Same deal, you wear a uniform to work. And of course, it was Idaho, not San Francisco. Went to New London. New London was a military town. There we lived in a BOQ because we were only there 5 weeks. Again, no problem. But the people who had problems were the people who would fly into San Francisco from Vietnam in uniform with their duffel bag, and that's where you see the abuses and the problems. I never saw it myself.
Yeah. You keep talking about guys making a career choice, and you keep mentioning Marines. Naval Academy graduates can become a Marine?
Oh yes, absolutely. The Marine Corps is part of the Navy Department. Yes, sir.
Yes.
Matter of fact, Ollie North,
right.
Marine, he's my classmate. Jim Webb, Secretary of Navy, is my classmate, Marine.
Oh yeah.
Mike Hagee, Commandant of the Marine Corps, my classmate, a Marine.
I see.
Yeah. Famous Marines.
Yeah. Were any of them your roommate?
None of those three, no.
No.
Mike Mullen, by the way, he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs. He was my classmate also.
Yeah.
A lot of famous classmates.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's interesting as heck. Yeah. To have to know the historical figures in our country, you know.
Mm. Well, you know, the funny thing is that you know, they were no different than you and me when we were there, and you know, it's just the way it goes.
I guess explain your last year and your graduation and your first assignment then.
Okay, well, let me tell you how I got into nuclear power. That's a story too. You basically have a number of choices. You got surface, nuclear power, Marine Corps, and aviation. And I chose to be a submariner for a number of reasons. I had a good experience during my summer experience. And I was a theoretical math major, and Admiral Rickover was in charge of the nuclear Navy. He liked engineering majors. He didn't like literature majors or anything like that. Right. And so in the spring of '68, we had to go interview with Admiral Rickover. Admiral Rickover personally interviewed every officer in the nuclear Navy, personally. And that's a lot of officers. You know, at that time the nuclear submarine force was being built up. And so what we had to do is we had to sign up. You had to be actually selected to go. You just couldn't sign up. You had to say, okay, you can go. We took a bus to Washington, D.C. for our interview with Admiral Rickover. And before the interview with him, we actually had 3 other interviews with people who worked for naval reactors. In many cases, they were civilians, but there were 3 separate interviews before you would go in to see Admiral Rickover. And people have written books about his interviews, but I had an experience. You know, I went in there and I wouldn't say I was cocky, but I was cocky. Okay, I was on a dean's list every semester. I was a theoretical math major. He liked that. Make matters worse, I played football. I just started the Army-Navy game, and we won the game the first time since Roger Staubach was a junior. And we're getting ready to go home for Christmas. So I'm feeling pretty cocky. Well, I go in there, and he looks at me, and I look at him, and my cockiness went to 0 immediately. I mean, he's scared to live and crap out of me just by looking at me. And I almost go blank thinking about the interview, but at one point he said, why did your grades go down? My grades never went down. They were monotonically increasing. And I gave some answer, and he started yelling at me. Then he said, so you were in a Catholic choir. I go, yes, sir, I am. He says, what's your favorite Christmas carol? Or he says, what's your favorite song? And I said, my favorite song is I named a Christmas carol. He says, God damn it, I didn't ask you what your favorite Christmas carol was. I asked you what your favorite song was. See, I had no right to modify his question before I answered it. He asked the question, I give the answer. I don't modify his question and give the answer. So he starts ranting at me on that. Then he says, stand up. I stand up. He says, start singing. No. And he said, get confused. Then he says, not a Christmas carol, what's your favorite song? I said, the Navy hymn. He said, stand up, start singing. So I'm singing the Navy hymn. And the Navy hymn is sung in 4 parts. I obviously sing one part of a 4-part song. So I'm singing my one part of a 4-part song, and I forget the words. And there's dead silence. He goes, yes, well? He says, I forgot the words. He says, he has two secretaries with big desks opposite his desk. Asked my secretaries how he liked it. So I had to chop over to one, how'd you like my singing? She says, very nice, thank you very much. And he says, get the hell out of here, and there are dozens of stories, and of course I did get into the program, but when I left, I didn't give a rat's whether I got in or not. But,
oh my God!
But he's famous for those interviews. I have dozens of interviews documented. It literally could be a book. And some are very cruel, by the way. Some are funny. Some are not so funny.
Wow, that had to be so intimidating and humbling.
Well, he was tough, and if you know Admiral Rickover's story, he's a very famous man. He was a tough taskmaster, but he understood that if you had a nuclear attack submarine in Tokyo and you had a nuclear accident, it could kill the whole program. And nuclear energy is what submarines are all about. World War II submarines were surface ships that would periodically submerge. Right. Nuclear submarines, we go under as long as we need to, and if you lose that capability, as part of the nuclear triad, obviously, that's serious. So he was very, very strict, always fail safe. That's why the training, was that. And in fact, after my active duty, I actually went back to the prototype in Idaho to train people to operate nuclear reactors. So the training was a big part of the process.
So how long after your interview with Admiral Rickover did you find out?
Probably about a couple of weeks later. When I thought about it, you could interview 3 times before you talk to him. He had a lot of information that was of substance before he harassed you for the interview, And so I think he probably knew well in advance whether or not you were going to be accepted. But you found out a couple of weeks later if you were, and then after graduation, you basically had like a month's leave before reporting to, in this case, Nuclear Power School in Mare Island, California. A 6-month school where it's basically classroom training on nuclear energy and how things work. And after that 6 months, then we get transferred to the prototype. A prototype is actual nuclear reactors. In the desert of Idaho, there are 3 prototypes. S1W, at least there used to be, S1W, prototype of the Nautilus, S5G, prototype of the Narwhal, and A1W, prototype of the Enterprise. Enterprise nuclear aircraft carriers, right. They have reactors too, so they're different reactors. So you basically would spend 6 months learning how to operate the nuclear reactor. Again, as an enlisted man in the engine rooms, and eventually standing in the control room as the officer in charge of the reactor. So that was a 6-month period. And then after that 6 months, so you had 6 months of nuclear power school, 6 months of the prototype, and then you would go to submarine school. And submarine school was again in New London, Connecticut, and it was a shortened course. Then they had been 6 months, and for some reason they shortened it to 5 weeks. I don't know why. But then the New London for 5 weeks, and then after that, that's when you reported to your first submarine assignment.
Wow. And what was your first submarine assignment?
That was the USS James Monroe. It's SSBN 622 Gold. It was coming out of the yard in Charleston, and just coming out of the yard, and we basically went on board, and we made a transit through the Panama Canal to Hawaii. That's when we arrived in Hawaii, for second time for me.
You said it was just coming out of the yard at Charleston,
Naval
South
Shipyard.
Carolina?
Yes.
And is that where it was built at?
No, I believe it was built at Electric Boat in New London.
Right.
But it went through an overhaul in Charleston.
Okay.
And after I got on board, we had to go test the torpedoes and test everything. And then they call it DESO, certain testing program. Then we transited via the Panama Canal to Hawaii, and that was a fun experience. And
Tell us about the Panama Canal.
it was fun.
Yeah.
A lot of people have gone on cruises through the Panama Canal, and I say I went through a cruise through the Panama Canal, didn't pay a penny. You know. But no, of course you're on the surface. Obviously, as a submarine, we arrived at the Panama Canal. There's like a queue, people waiting to go through. We basically hovered for a couple of days, and then we went through. And you go through the locks just like everybody else.
Regular ship.
And I mean, it was fun. And of course, it was Panama. It was hot. It was green. It was steamy. I know one of the issues we had a throttle valve that leaked to the main engine, and you know the concern was you would get into the lock with the both in the lock with both gates shut, and there'd be a leak, and the submarine would start to move forward. And so we literally had somebody in the engine room with a sledgehammer that in case his throttle valve got stuck, he could knock it and close it. That was kind of a funny thing I remember.
And this is the James Monroe, the nuclear sub.
Right.
Yeah. So after you go through the Panama Canal, where do you go?
We went right to Hawaii.
Oh, right to Hawaii.
Yeah, and it was a long trip, and that was fun. And then we arrived in Hawaii, and in most cases, of course, I was single, but other people had their dependents, so the kids and the wives were on the pier with leis waving, and it was, you know, big celebration and fun. And that was before the submarine then went to Guam. Guam is where they made the patrols, and that's when you started the blue gold crew business, where one crew would be on a ship and the other one would be in Hawaii, and then you'd flip.
So you got a blue and a gold crew, and the function of a blue or a gold crew is what? Is it for 90 days or?
Yes, basically 90 days. Yes, and you know there are two captains, you know, two complete crews, and for example, we made the transit to Hawaii. The blue crew then took the submarine to Guam, and we went on a patrol.
Okay.
They came back into Guam 2 months later. We flew from Hawaii to Guam. We had a 5-day turnover where basically everybody had a counterpart. You turn over the equipment, the records, everything. And after the turnover, the one commanding officer would relieve the other, and that crew would now fly back to Hawaii for R&R. And they basically would get a month off to rest. Then 2 months they'd have to go through additional training before the cycle started again. So it was just two crews where you flip 3 months at a time.
And what naval base is at Guam?
Big submarine base.
Yeah.
Agana, Guam.
Is that the name of it?
Agana?
I
think Agana, Anderson Air Force Base is there.
There.
Agana is the city, and as I recall, there's a
big bay there.
Big bay.
Right.
And you would basically, after you relieve the other crew after the 5 days, you would go through a refit period, you know, 3 or 4 weeks, where now you get everything maintained and up to speed before you went on the 2-month patrol.
And tell us, what is a patrol?
Well, the patrol at that time was nominally 60 days. I can't talk classified things, but you would go to an assigned area, and you basically would remain undetected. You know the purpose of a nuclear submarine.
You're underwater this whole time.
Sure. The purpose of a nuclear submarine and part of the nuclear triad is to basically be able to launch a strike without being knocked out first. The interesting thing about nuclear submarines is when you're in the ocean, you're cruising around, they can't detect you, at least not easily. So they don't know where you are. So in other words, if you're in the middle of the South China Sea and you launch a nuclear weapon, you know, they don't know from where it's coming from or where it's coming from until it strikes. And you know, that's part of the nuclear triad. You know, the Air Force with the big missiles, you had the B-52s dropping bombs, and you had the nuclear submarines.
So that's a triad you're referring to?
Yeah, exactly. And the deal was to basically go out and be submerged essentially for the entire time and remain undetected, so nobody knew where you were. Now you were in communication, but if you had to launch, you would launch.
How do you communicate?
Well, there's a way of communicating there.
Okay.
Yeah. It's probably not classified now, and it can't possibly be, but you used to trail a wire. You know, you'd be submerged, and there was a way to get an antenna to receive information.
Okay.
And that reminds me of a story. we were in Guam and a typhoon was coming. And we had to do an emergency sortie. In other words, we couldn't be in port for if a typhoon came because we'd be damaged. So we had to basically get out of port. And at that time, we didn't have as much wire as we needed. And I was communicator then. I was in charge of the communications. And my chief was Master Chief Doolittle, great guy. He says, we need more wire. And of course, he knew more than than I knew what we needed. And I said, okay, well, let's go get some. So basically, the whole base is in a panic. We got to get out of there like in 24 hours. So he goes to get the wire, and there's nobody there. It's in chaos. I mean, there's like, who are we going to check it out with? He comes back to me and says, we need the wire. Can I just go grab it? And I would just take it. I said, go ahead, do it. We need it. He did it. And so I don't know, it's worth $100,000 or something. We grabbed the wire, bring it on board, ship, splice it. We got the wire. It's long enough now to receive the signal. And nobody ever said a word, ever. We went out to sea, got through the typhoon. Nobody ever asked for the wire back. He was a great guy, Chief Doolittle, let me tell you. But I forgot where we were.
No. So you would do a 60-day
patrol.
And did you ever have any experiences while you were under the water there?
Yeah. The normal routine was, if you were an officer, a nuclear officer, you would stand one watch in charge of the nuclear reactor, and then the next watch you'd be an officer of the deck, with the periscope in the control room. And so if you were nuclear, you went back and forth, which was nice because you had the variety, and also you were knowledgeable on not only how the submarine worked, but also how the reactor worked, which is what they wanted. Mm-hmm. And of course, the CO and XO had to be nuclear trained. We had one situation where, going to Hawaii, we had a reduction gear problem, and we were like going at 4 knots on our emergency propulsion motor in the middle of the Pacific, and we had a great machinist mate officer who got it fixed somehow, and that's how we made it to Hawaii. But we had a big problem that way. The big problems on patrol, you tried to remain hidden and everything, but when you left Guam or came into Guam, that was obviously a point where Russian submarines and Russians knew where you were going to be, and so they tried to track you. So we had some interesting experiences that way.
There's so many questions there, and I keep thinking of them while you're talking, and then I lose my train of thought. You have to forgive me.
I do too.
What about radiation? When a guy like me off the streets, thinks about a nuclear submarine, I think about radiation.
Sure. Well, number one, your radiation is monitored continuously. Everybody has a personal dosimetry to monitor the radiation you receive. But the plant is designed to minimize radiation exposure. Shielding, there's special shielding between compartments, shielding of the reactor. You monitor the air, you monitor the water, you monitor the radiation levels all over the ship. Again, you're monitored with the dosimeter and radiation badges. And when you do everything right, it's not a problem. And it's never been a problem for me, and we've never had a problem in that regard.
So you would go back to Guam when you're
after the patrol.
After the patrol, and then the blue team would come in.
Right, for the 5 days.
Yeah, and then you would go to Hawaii and have
30 days off before starting training again.
Now, did you ever go home during that time, or did you ever have anybody from home visit you?
Actually, my dad came out during one off crew. He came out for about a week and 10 days, had a great time. My mom didn't want to come because she was afraid of flying. But my dad came out, and he actually had some associate he knew in Milwaukee who was there, an older fella. He hung around with us for a couple of days, but we did a lot of touring of Hawaii. We went on board a number of Navy ships, including aircraft carriers, and it was a fun time. I was really happy he came, and it was terrific, really.
How many patrols did you do there?
I made 3 patrols out of Guam. We made the transit through the Panama Canal, then 3 patrols out of Guam. And there's another story. One day we're on our off crew, and we used to have an office on Ford Island. Ford Island, of course, was where Pearl Harbor was attacked. And I was on a ferry to Ford Island, and there was a Naval Academy guy sitting next to me, an officer in another submarine, who was in a class of 65. I was 68. And I'm talking to him, he says, how'd you like to go to Idaho as an instructor? Idaho is where I had trained for 6 months. Now he said, how would you like to go back to Idaho as an instructor? And I said, yeah, I wouldn't mind doing that. So we go on patrol. I'm communicator, and first thing in the morning we get up, go into the wardroom, have breakfast. The radio man would bring you all of the messages. And one of the messages was, I'm assigned to Idaho. I go, holy crap. So I relieve as officer at the deck. So we're cruising there, I say, oh my God, I know what's gonna happen. So the captain comes out, great guy, Captain J.C. Harris, comes out with the message board. And he sits in his captain's chair, and I'm in front here, right on the con. And he's going through the messages, and he sees this, he says, I'm not gonna let you go. And what am I gonna say? I said, aye, sir, you know, what could I do? And well, it didn't work that way. When Rickover ordered you to go to Idaho, you went to Idaho. And so we got back to Hawaii. Believe it or not, I had to go to Tripler Army Hospital because I had a dislocated shoulder from a football wound in the Army-Navy game. I had to have my shoulder operated on. And so that delayed my trip to Idaho, but basically went to Idaho for a year and a half at the Nuclear Power Training Unit, which is where I met my wife, who was a nursing student at ISU, so that worked out. So anyway, Admiral Rickover, when he sends you to Idaho, you go to Idaho.
So he is actually still in commander of all of the
He was in charge of the entire Navy nuclear program, including the submarines, the training, the nuclear power school, everything. He was a very powerful, there are books about Admiral Rickover. He was
Yes.
a lot of people didn't like him, and he was a very successful man though.
Yes. So you're assigned to Idaho, and what is your job there now, and what time frame is this?
This is like 1971 to 73, something like that.
Okay.
And again, there are the 3 reactor prototypes. I was assigned this time to A1W, which was the aircraft carrier reactor. Not that it made any difference, a reactor is a reactor, but it was a different reactor. And essentially we trained now people how to operate the nuclear reactor. Just as I had gone to nuclear power school for 6 months and went to the prototype for 6 months, now I was at the prototype training those people who would come to the prototype for 6 months. And so officer and enlisted, they'd have to go through a qualification program in order to be able to operate a nuclear reactor before they went off to submarine school, if they were going to submarine school, or otherwise they would go directly onto a nuclear surface ship.
And how long were you there in Idaho?
It was about a year and a half. And then, of course, I met my future wife.
I was just going to ask you, how did you, what is her name? First of all?
Roxanne.
Roxanne, and her maiden name was?
Curry.
Curry, C?
C-U-R-R-Y.
How did you meet her?
We met her, she'll tell it was a different story, but it was like a blind date. I met somebody in the ISU Student Union who said his girlfriend had a friend who might want to get out. She was really nice, so I called her up, and we ended up having a first and second date, and things worked out. And then, you know, a year and a half later, because I left the Navy, you know, because not that I didn't like the Navy. I actually stayed in the reserve and retired, as you know. But nuclear power, commercial industry was booming. I had 15 job offers. I mean, you know, it was just unbelievable. I mean, now it's a different world, you know. And I actually interviewed with a company called NUS in Maryland. And, you know, again, I had 15 job offers, right? I went out for interview there, and they said, I'd like you to come back for another interview. Well, what, another interview? I mean, I got 15 job offers. They want to interview me again. So I said, okay. I said, can I bring my fiancée? She wasn't. They said, sure. So they fly her out, both of us out. And while I'm going through my my interview, she's driving around Washington, D.C. She'd never been in any big city at all. And she's driving around in a big car, looking at all the monuments. And so anyway, we got married a year later.
What was the date of your marriage?
We were married June 1st, 1974.
1974. When did you get out of the Navy then?
I got out of the Navy basically in like August of 73. But I stayed in the reserve for the next 15, 20 years.
What rank were you when you got out of the Navy?
Active lieutenant.
Lieutenant. And what's ISU? What does that mean?
Idaho State University.
Okay. And where's that located?
Pocatello.
Where?
Pocatello, Idaho.
Oh, okay. I'm not really familiar with ISU, but so I thought I'd better clear that up for the interview. So, who did you take a job with after you got out of the Navy?
It was called a company called NUS Corporation, Nuclear Utility Services, and it was involved in a lot of these utilities who were having their first nuclear power plant. And then specifically, I was involved in training. We trained people to operate nuclear power plants. They had to go through a civilian qualification program at their utility, like Duke Energy or Pacific Gas and Electric. And we made videotapes, and we were there for a number of years. And it was, I think I've been at every nuclear power plant in the United States, many of which have shut down, by the way.
Yeah. Maybe we should talk about that a little bit too. How many nuclear power plants did we have in this country?
I think there were like 60 or 65, something like that.
And were they all located on waterways?
They all needed a source of cooling. So in general, there was either a river or a cooling tower or an ocean. But you needed, cooling towers are the same effect as a river or an ocean. You can.
Now, and did we ever have any trouble or problems with nuclear power plants?
Well, the big problem was 3 Mile Island. The industry was booming, and 3 Mile Island, which was, of course, in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, General Public Utilities, they had an accident. Nobody was hurt or killed, but it was, a fairly severe incident, and that resulted in many regulatory and technical changes that made the nuclear industry much more costly, and it affected the economics. And then subsequently you had Chernobyl, and the nuclear industry is not near what it was. I mean, it used to be booming, and now many of the plants that I worked at 30 years ago are now shut down, and I don't know if a single commercial nuclear power plant is even under construction. For years I was involved in the American Nuclear Society. I was chairman of some of the divisions, and we dealt with all of these things. And I don't even know if the American Nuclear Society is still functioning. It's just, the industry has turned around terribly, despite the fact that, the people who complain about global warming, nuclear power is actually positive for the global warming problem.
Have we had any long-term negative effects because of nuclear power in this country?
No.
No, like that 3 Mile Island, for example.
Was
that contained, or?
Well, it was contained. Procedures were changed. There has been a lot of discussion about, what do you do with spent nuclear fuel? Yucca Mountain in Nevada. How do you store nuclear fuel? When you have the core of a nuclear reactor and you operate it, it becomes highly radioactive, and so it has to be, with half-life of perhaps thousands of years.
Right. So
it's got to be controlled and contained and stored. And there's a site in Nevada called Yucca Mountain, which is a safe geological storage. And there are other places, and because I've lost touch with this over the past couple of decades, but it's all, there have never been any serious deaths in this country due to nuclear energy, despite the scares at 3 Mile Island.
Is it more a mental problem with the public and politicians, or?
Well, I think
if that could be the answer.
Well, I think the argument has diminished in volume. 20 years ago, after 3 Mile Island, people would say we want to stop nuclear power, but the cost got so high, you're not building any new ones, and the regulatory commissions who set rates, sometimes they give utilities encouragement to do something by agreeing to a certain rate increase or decrease. Do you put the plant in a rate base or don't you? And other questions like that. And just a lot of things have piled up in opposition to nuclear powers. And I think the concern over climate change right now probably is not enough to get it turned around.
Yeah.
The whole infrastructure, GE, Westinghouse, Babcock and Wilcox, all those nuclear steam suppliers, I think they're out of the business. The world has changed.
I want to go back to your submarine duties. You were patrolling, and I'm sure a lot of it is still classified, so I'll just say you were patrolling off of the coast of perceived enemies, whether it be
right.
North Vietnam or China or even the USSR. or maybe perhaps even some off of the coast of the Near East there. In Strategic Air Command, we had a program we called Fail Safe, and a positive control was the actual name of it.
Mm-hmm.
Because once you had reached a certain point, you could only be called back with certain key
Sure.
communication. What's the, we always see where there's a renegade submarine commander going to nuke somebody. How is this controlled in the submarine service?
Well, it's highly controlled. I was communicator, so I was in charge of all the nuclear war codes, by the way. It's all dual man. One guy can't go crazy and cause it. You're apparently vetted so that you don't put crazy people in charge of these nuclear weapons. But in addition, one person alone cannot do the deed. There's authentications, there's verifications to make sure that somebody can't inadvertently launch a nuclear attack when it's not supposed to happen.
So, but there has to be a communication from a higher power.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah,
And
and
how-
it has to be authenticated. That's the key thing.
Okay.
There are plans, but people just don't say launch. There's got to be authenticated,
Yeah,
and there are different target packages too. So it's
right. And how many nuclear weapons do you carry on, or is missile the right term to use for that?
it was a different answer, but the answer is yes, 16.
16. Okay. So you theoretically have 16 primary targets and 16.
Well, some nuclear weapons have multiple warheads.
That's good. We didn't know that. That's interesting.
That can't possibly be classified after this many years.
Yeah. So how many targets theoretically could you have one submarine?
A lot.
Lot. Okay, that's well put. Well, it's interesting, to guys on the street like myself. You sometimes wonder, by authentication, do you have prearranged codes that have to be answered?
Yes.
Yeah. And how does this second guy with you that has to control you, or you control him, so that we know it's a valid?
Yeah, I don't know if I can go through the detailed procedure because I don't know if it's still classified.
Yeah. Well,
But
just
there are controls. One person inadvertently could not do it alone.
okay. All right. So it takes two at your end after you've been notified. Okay. It has to be. That has to require some intense training
It does.
Yeah. Brian, I know you can't answer the question, but that's I'm familiar with the Air Force's part end of that, but yours are attacks in that submarine that we will successfully launch when the time comes. And thank God for you, nuclear submarine.
Well, that's what they call it, strategic deterrent. Deterrent is the key word, deter.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Question time for me?
Yes, sir.
Well, I was just wondering, you grew up in Milwaukee.
Mm-hmm.
You're not too far from Great Lakes, which was a big training for the Navy.
Mm-hmm.
I guess you didn't want to go the route of being an enlisted man.
Well, not that I didn't want to. I went to the Naval Academy, and I was aware of Great Lakes, but I did not go there.
Right. I was just kind of curious. You said you had to be sponsored, I guess, was that a congressman?
Mm-hmm.
So did you just cold call him, or did you know somebody who knew him? How did you go about
Well,
getting that?
There's an official application process. In other words, you would basically you'd call the congressman, and I forget if the Naval Academy told you to contact. I kind of forget those details. But you would have to make an application. You have to say to the congressman, I'd like to apply for an appointment to the Naval Academy or West Point or Air Force. And he'd say, okay, here's the rules. You're going to have to do this. You've got to submit this paperwork, go through these interviews, take the SATs, lots of letters of recommendation, You know, again, the interviews too, you know, they'd interview you. So it was it was like a hiring process. And, you know, of course, I mean, it's a big deal getting a scholarship there. I mean, I think it cost you $350,000 to go to the Naval Academy for 4 years. You know, so it's a big deal. They put in a lot of money into you, and they want to make sure they get a return, which is quite fair.
Did you have other people in your family that had been in the military at some point?
Well, my dad was in the Air Force during World War II.
You mentioned that. I'm
Yeah.
sorry, I forgot about that
Yeah.
part. But was he around to offer advice?
Sure.
Do you remember anything he said about any suggestions he thought you should do?
Well, he always told me to work hard and be smart, you know.
He didn't want you to go in the Air Force?
No, he was in the Army Air Corps, but Army Air Force.
Oh, right, okay.
But of course there was an Air Force then. But no, he was happy with the Naval Academy. You know, he went through the same catalogs I did. You know, spring in Annapolis. That's what Joe Bellino said. He looked at you know, when Joe Bellino was at the Naval Academy, he looked at the catalogs too, and he said, "Gray West Point or blue Annapolis. I'm going to Annapolis." You know.
Yeah. I mean, you were serving during the Vietnam era. I mean, how much was that on your mind? I mean, obviously you weren't going to be in country or anything like that, but.
No, that's a really good question. The Vietnam War was at its peak during much of my service, but I was in a different chapter of the war. You know, I mean, I knew what was going on. I followed the war. I had many classmates who were killed in the war or wounded in the war. I had famous classmates who served in the war, but I was in a different strategic war. We were in the Polaris nuclear submarine, nuclear deterrent business, and it was just different. And you know, we're going to Vietnam on a trip, by the way, in a couple of months. So if somebody ever asks me in the future, "Jerry, you've ever been to Vietnam?" I'll go, "Yeah." Last year.
You know, we always think of submarines. We think of World War II and torpedoes and things like that. I was curious, when did the nuclear age of submarines start to develop? Is that right after World War II? And at that time that you got involved with it, I mean, how many nuclear submarines were there? How big was the fleet compared to, say, the fleet out of World War II? How much was that still around? Do you have much memory of it?
Okay, well, there's a lot of questions. First, there were a lot of World War II submarines in World War II, and many of them still existed when I entered the nuclear Navy. You know, when you talk about a nuclear submarine, there are two issues. Number one is the propulsion plant and then weapons. The Nautilus was the first nuclear-powered submarine. See, and the importance of nuclear power in a submarine is you can submerge indefinitely. See, a diesel submarine is a surface ship. You know, they have a snorkel, you need air, you have an engine, and basically you charge your batteries, and then you button everything up and you submerge temporarily for not that long, you know, a day or two or whatever. And when you run out of energy, you basically come to the surface, you snorkel again, you take air in, you charge your batteries, you start your engines, you know, you do all that stuff. So the Nautilus was the first nuclear power submarine in 1954. That enabled a submarine to submerge indefinitely. That led to the decision to make not attack submarines. Attack submarines don't have the big missiles, they just have torpedoes. To go to Polaris submarines, basically larger submarines that could submerge indefinitely, that would remain undetected, that was able to launch missiles from the, not the bottom, but from the ocean deep, undetected. That's why I call it nuclear deterrent. They don't know where the nuclear submarines are. If they knew where every nuclear submarine was with missiles, you know, they might try to preemptive attack to try to kill the submarines before you could get them, but they can't do that because they can't find you. And you're all over the place and you're keeping on moving around. And that's why it's part of the nuclear deterrent. And so, you know, of course, nuclear weapons were obviously developed during World War II. And so what happened in the 50s, nuclear energy to power a submarine, nuclear weapons, which had been developed during World War II, came together. Now you had a Polaris submarine is able to submerge indefinitely, remain undetected, and launch nuclear weapons. What a great deterrent. That's really what it amounts to.
So I guess it had been maybe around a decade or a little more.
Well,
you were assigned
yeah.
first.
Well, the first attack submarine was '54, and I think the first Polaris, I kind of forget, but it was about like 1960, something like that. You know, and I forget, was it George Washington? You know, I forget which one it was. I think it was 588, the George Washington.
So you guys were still a relatively new program, I guess. Or?
Yeah, relatively, yeah, relative to now, yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
What was the crew level? How many people would be on that kind of submarine? How many people?
I think we had about like 110 on the Polaris submarine. I mean, they were big boats, 425 feet long. I mean, they were big. And, you got into a routine. It was good being an officer if you were officer of deck because you call it periscope liberty. You'd be in a Japanese sea lanes, you'd surface at night, not surface, you'd come to periscope depth at night and you'd look around, you'd see these freighters going by with their lights on, they had no clue you were out there. And they call that periscope liberty. And sometimes the enlisted guys would come by and they'd ask for a look, just for a look to see what it was like, to get some periscope liberty, just do a little sweep. And but it was fun times.
How many different submarines did you serve on when you were active?
Actually, only that one. I'd been on a Redfish as a midshipman on that cruise, and then to James Monroe. Had I stayed in the Navy, I no doubt would have gone back on another submarine, probably as engineer. That would have been a natural progression.
Did you know people that you served with who continued on as a career?
Oh, sure, many.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
In the submarine?
Yes, well, sure.
What did you do in the Naval Reserves? What did you?
Well, Naval Reserve, strangely enough, had very little to do with my active duty. It didn't quite work that way. You think you would go into a unit that had to do with nuclear energy, but most of my assignments were, one was MARAD, the commercial marine industry. I was in a unit in Charleston on the USS Frank Cable, which is a submarine tender. Matter of fact, I was on the submarine tender when the Challenger exploded. I'm literally watching it. That was quite an experience. But during my reserve, I went to Europe a couple of times, London, Scotland, San Francisco. Every year you go 2 weeks. I mean, I enjoyed it. I mean, once you go to the Naval Academy, just because I left active duty didn't mean I didn't like the Navy, and it was fun.
How did you end up here in Cincinnati? Was it because your nuclear field?
Yeah, I had a number of jobs. But basically, I started out in Maryland at NUS. Remember I talked about that in an interview. From there, I went to South Carolina. I worked for Chem Nuclear, which was a company involved in the nuclear waste business. Then went back to form a subsidiary company for NUS where I'd come from. Then we were merged with another company and sold to Westinghouse. It's a long story. But, this is all in the commercial nuclear power industry. And, that's what I did. Now, how do we end up in Cincinnati? You ever hear of the Fernald plant north of town? Well, basically, we bid with Fluor to take over the operation of that plant from Westinghouse. And I was the proposal manager for that deal. It was a $3 billion job. It was a big deal. And we won that job, and then I came up as vice president of recycling and technology programs. And that's what brought us to Cincinnati.
What year was that?
Oh, geez, I forget. Long time ago.
80s, I guess?
Yeah, probably late 80s.
And how often, with the reserves duty, how often did you do that? Monthly?
You'd go 1 weekend a month. On a Saturday and a Sunday, basically a 8 to 5 schedule. You train and drill and do things like that. And
where would you go for that?
well, it depends where I lived, but if you were in Columbia, South Carolina, you'd go downtown and there was a Naval Reserve Center, and they would host the meetings.
What about in the Cincinnati area?
I was not in the reserve in Cincinnati. I had been out by that time.
Okay. Well, I just have one last question. Because you were on the Navy team and he's from Cincinnati, you must have ran into Roger Staubach, who was a Heisman Trophy winner.
I got a picture of him right here, as a matter of fact. Yeah, strangely enough, I'll tell you some football stories. Number one, when I took the SATs, that was in November of '63, which you had to do at the Naval Academy. That was the day that Navy beat Army with the ball in the 3-yard line as the game ended, ran out of time. It was a huge game. Of course, Roger Staubach, that year he won the Heisman Trophy. So I go to the Naval Academy, and Roger Staubach is a senior. He had won a Heisman Trophy as a junior. He hurts his ankle or his knee against Penn State in the opener. And basically, 1964 was a bad year for Navy. Roger Staubach was injured. We lost the Army-Navy game. So the only Army-Navy game that Roger Staubach, or the last Army-Navy game that had been won by Navy was the '63 game with Roger Staubach. So I go to the Naval Academy, and he's a senior, and have a kind of a poor season. I used to carry him around the mess hall. You know, you used to put him in a chair and carry these heroes around the mess hall. So Roger Staubach, we lose the Army his senior year, and of course he leaves. I ended up going out for football. I played as a sophomore, and I was pretty good. I went out as a junior. I made the team as a junior, and then I played every game as a senior, and I started one game, the Army-Navy game, in '67. So the previous Army-Navy game that had been won was when Roger Staubach won the Heisman Trophy in '63. The next time we won, I started the game. So that was kind of a big deal, and a lot of fun. You know, I played against Penn State, Michigan. I tackled Larry Zonk. I got a picture of me tackling Larry Zonk in this package. So that was a lot of fun.
So they would play those in Philadelphia every year, wouldn't they?
Typically, Philadelphia is the place, yes. JFK, yep, 102,000 people.
My family's from Philly, that's why I'm familiar with that.
Oh, okay,
stadium.
okay,
My
yeah.
dad was in the Navy, so.
Okay.
Well, that's all the questions I can do. Do you have any other ones you want
Yeah,
to
you
follow?
opened up a few more for me, if you don't mind. A subtender.
Mhm.
What's a subtender do for you?
A subtender basically services a submarine. In other words, if you were a submarine, you would come into a port. You know, instead of going into a dock, you would tie up right next to the tender. The tender had missiles, water, fuel, batteries, food, technicians, machine shops. They were able to do the maintenance required. Basically, they were like a logistics support,
Like going to the-
mobile logistics support.
Going to the convenience store and getting everything you need.
Yeah, and of course, you know, there are not only submarine tenders, there are tenders for regular ships. You know,
Right.
World War II, these ships would come in and be served by a tender.
Yeah. How long would you stay underwater on
Well, typically 60 days.
60 days? You've
Yeah,
done it.
when you left Guam, you'd get out deep enough, and you'd submerge. You would not surface for 60 days.
And at what depth would you say?
I can't tell you. I'm sure it's not classified anymore, but
Very deep. That's good enough. That's good. I don't want, no. You have your own water purification
Yes.
processes aboard this submarine?
yes, you convert seawater to fresh water.
And how did that taste?
Fine,
Huh?
perfect,
Perfect? And
no problem.
any problems with food storage?
No, you had freezers, and we ate very well. I mean, you would be surprised how well we ate.
Okay. And you said there were like 110 people? on
Something
board?
like that. It's my
Something like
recollection. Yes.
At periscope depth, you can tell me what periscope depth is.
Well, periscope depth is where you don't surface the submarine. You know, let's say you look at the submarine here, and you got the sail, and you got a periscope. When you surface, you basically come above the water. You can see the entire submarine, much like you see some of these pictures. You see the entire submarine, right?
Mm-hmm.
That would be surface. You go to periscope depth, you basically are just below the surface, and the only thing that rises above the water is the periscope. So in other words, if you were looking at the ocean and there was a submarine there at periscope depth, you would not see the submarine. You might or might not see the periscope. For example, let's see here.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
I don't know if there's one on the actual surface.
Um,
That's going through the Panama Canal there.
Now that periscope, you know, like when you read about these things, or you just not having been in the Navy, you just think of a small object. This is a pretty big device, isn't it?
Very big, yes.
Yeah.
Very big.
I mean,
And
it's-
hydraulics, you'd basically,
mean,
if you come to depth, you'd have to do this. The hydraulics would raise it above, then you would turn it. You could look up. You used to get fixes from stars. You know, it could look up and know where you're supposed to be and know where a star was supposed to be. It goes, zzz, zzz, it'd look for the star, you'd align it, and that'd give you a line of position to help identify your position.
Now you could that would be like a navigator, so to speak, reading the stars and
Now, you had other ways of,
putting your position.
but the location was obviously critically important. And so we had multiple ways to exactly define what our position was.
How do you know? What tells you you're not going to run into something while you're submerged. Is that done by what we think of as sonar?
Well, there's sonar.
I'm not in the Navy. That's
Sure.
why I just,
Well, number one, the important thing is to know where you are. If you know where you are in the ocean, exactly, the ocean has been surveyed, you know what the depth is, you know if there are underwater mountains, so you got to know where you're at to begin with. Sonar is either active or passive. Passive means you just listen. So if you're going to bump into a mountain, you're not going to hear the mountain. Active sonar, you always ping and it bounces back. So if you were submerged and you went to active sonar, you might be able to see an underwater object. Active sonar is also used to basically locate surface ships. If there was a surface ship out there, you could basically turn on your active sonar, ping, and you would have an indication of what distance and what range and what direction the contact was.
so you don't always have active sonar on when you're submerged?
You specifically did not, because you can be detected with active sonar.
Okay.
So you did not use active sonar. So your job as a Polaris submarine was to remain undetected. That's the name of the game.
Yeah. Let's see. Why did you have a difficult? I think of you, or I try to put myself in the place of your superior officer, and you're a valuable commodity. You've had all this training, and we don't have that many people qualified in your field. Did you have a tough time getting out of the service?
Well, you mean for my own personal desire, or with the Navy?
With the Navy?
Not really. I mean, you basically have an obligation. When you graduate from the academy, you had a 5-year obligation
Right.
to serve for 5 years. And at the end of 5 years, you were perfectly entitled to resign, or you could elect to stay in the reserve, which I did. But they had bonuses, by the way, for nuclear trained people at that time. If you stayed in the extended, they'd give you a bonus of so much money. I forget how much it was, but not the problem. The situation when I left, the nuclear industry was booming. I mean, I had 15 interviews and 15 job offers with some of the biggest companies in America.
Right.
And, so you're a 27-year-old kid, that's a little heady, and I can still stay in reserve. I mean, I was president of the Naval Academy alumni here in Cincinnati for like 15, 20 years. I maintained all my contacts with the Naval Academy. We go to all of the reunions. I have many friends. We still correspond. So
I just thought they might have given you a hard time,
No.
Going to work in the civilian field, after.
No, you didn't. I didn't see that at all.
Okay. Yeah. Let's go back to your wife. Your wife, did you have any children?
Two adopted children.
Two adopted, and their names?
Christine and Brian.
Christine and Brandon?
Brian.
Brian?
Mm-hmm.
And any grandchildren?
3 grandchildren with Christine.
And their names?
Carson, Gabrielle, and Robbie.
I see. And did your wife have employment?
My wife is a registered nurse.
Uh-huh. And did she work at?
She worked as a nurse for many years of our marriage. Yes.
Any hospitals locally or anything?
She was in charge of a unit at Good Sam, and I forget which unit, but she's had very responsible positions at hospitals.
Uh-huh. Now you're both now retired.
Yes.
I see. And you live here locally in Cincinnati?
Yeah, we live 4th Street, 8 blocks from here, less than 8 blocks.
I see. Brian, do you have anything else you wanted to add?
Yeah, one thing I did want to ask you was about your major at the Naval Academy. Why that particular, why you wanted to study that field? I guess you were pretty good at it.
Well, I always was good math, and I enjoyed math, and
It was theoretical math.
yeah, theoretical math of all things.
Yeah.
Which is, can you describe?
Yeah,
for
can you-
layman what-
I forgot. It's good too. Yeah, it's.
I don't think you could explain it to me, to be honest
could-
with you.
I don't think I
you
could either.
You could explain it, but I mean, with my feeble
Sounds like
mind here.
quantum physics maybe, or something
Yeah.
going on that level.
Yeah, it's something like that. I kind of forgot myself.
Boy.
But Rickover liked engineering and math. He liked the sciences. He didn't like English.
Right.
You were a poetry major. That didn't work. Operate a nuclear reactor.
Yeah, I can see that. But
Did anybody, any of your maybe your grandkids, anybody interested in the military career at all?
Well, the grandkids are 10, 8, and 5, so it's a little too early.
Did you
Okay.
say great-grandkids?
No, I said grandkids.
Oh, grand.
I think we have 3 grandkids.
Right.
Well, that's only questions I can think of.
Well, I appreciate this interview very much.
Well, I've
Gary.
enjoyed talking to you.
It's been enlightening, and I'm glad you could share with us what you could about your military service. Our country is very fortunate to have folks like you that have served in our nuclear force, and I mean that sincerely. I know I only got to the surface on what you did, and because of the classified nature of your work, but I feel very personally comfortable that we have people like you that served our country. And I want to
Well, thank you. I thank you.
I want to thank you for the interview and for your service to our country.
Well, thank
too.
you, sir.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah.